The morning air hung heavy with an unusual stillness over the naval base at Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941, a date which would soon be etched into the collective memory of a nation. At 7:55 a.m., the peaceful, Hawaiian Sunday shattered into chaos as the first Japanese warplanes appeared over the horizon, their distinctive red sun emblems catching the morning light. Within moments, the tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor transformed into a hellscape of fire, smoke, and desperate struggle that would forever alter the course of world history. "I looked up and saw the bombs falling," recalled Seaman First Class James Walters, his eyes still wide with remembered terror even decades later. "They just kept coming and coming. The sky was black with planes. The attack had been meticulously planned by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant naval strategist who had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. Though he personally harbored reservations about war with America, he executed his duty with remarkable precision. 2 waves of Japanese aircraft, 353 in total, launched from 6 aircraft carriers that had maintained strict radio silence during their 3,000-mile journey across the Pacific. The first torpedo struck the USS California at 7:58 a.m. From that moment, Pearl Harbor became a scene of unimaginable devastation. The battleship USS Arizona erupted in a cataclysmic explosion when a bomb penetrated her forward ammunition magazine, killing 1,177 men in an instant. The USS Oklahoma capsized after multiple torpedo hits, trapping hundreds of sailors inside her overturned hull. The coordination and tactical precision of the Japanese attack remains one of the most studied military operations in naval history, notes Dr. Elizabeth Harrington in her seminal work, Pacific Storm: The Road to Pearl Harbor. The striking force achieved complete tactical surprise, despite numerous warning signs that American intelligence failed to piece together. As sailors scrambled to battle stations, many wearing only undergarments, their training competed with shock. Some managed extraordinary feats of bravery amid the carnage. Doris Miller, an African-American mess attendant on the USS West Virginia, had never been trained on anti-aircraft guns due to the Navy's racial policies. Yet when his ship was hit, he manned a machine gun and reportedly shot down several Japanese aircraft, becoming one of the first American heroes of World War II. At Wheeler and Hickam airfields, American planes were parked wingtip to wingtip, deliberately positioned to prevent sabotage but inadvertently creating perfect targets for air attack. Japanese fighters strafed them mercilessly, destroying most of America's air defense capability within minutes. The second wave hit at 8:50 a.m., focusing on ships that had escaped the first assault. By then, some anti-aircraft batteries had become operational, and the Japanese encountered fiercer resistance. Plumes of black smoke billowed thousands of feet into the air, visible from every point on Oahu. Civilians in Honolulu watched in horror as their island paradise became a battleground. By 10 a.m., the attack was over. The Japanese aircraft had returned to their carriers, which immediately set course back to Japan. In their wake, they left 2,403 Americans dead, 1,178 wounded, 18 ships sunk or damaged, and nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, watched the devastation through his office window. A spent Japanese bullet crashed through the glass, narrowly missing him. "It would have been merciful had it killed me," he later remarked, knowing his career was over. As according to reporting in the Honolulu Star Bulletin's emergency edition that afternoon, war has come to Hawaii and the United States. The rising sun of Japan has been imprinted on Hawaii in fire, death, and destruction. In Tokyo, upon hearing of the attack's success, Admiral Yamamoto did not join in the celebrations. Instead, he is said to have remarked somberly, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's voice crackled through radio speakers across America, his words deliberate and charged with grim determination. Less than 24 hours after the attack, Roosevelt stood before Congress seeking a declaration of war. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin of Montana dissented, staying true to her pacifist principles despite the overwhelming national mood. The transformation of American society began almost immediately. A nation that had stubbornly clung to isolationism for years suddenly found itself united in purpose. Men lined up at recruitment offices in such numbers that processing them became problematic. "I was 18 years old and I joined the Marines the day after the attack," recalled Thomas Hendricks, who would later fight at Guadalcanal. "My mother cried, but she didn't try to stop me. Nobody did. It was just what you did." Industry pivoted to wartime production with astounding speed. Automobile factories began producing tanks and aircraft, while civilian goods faced rationing. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking up welding torches and rivet guns as Rosie the Riveter became a national icon. Within months, America was transforming into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. The speed with which the American economy converted to wartime production remains one of the most remarkable economic transformations in history, wrote economist Paul Johnston in The Economics of War, published by the University of Chicago Press. By 1943, the United States was producing more military equipment than all Axis powers combined. On the home front, fear of further attacks led to troubling developments. Executive Order 9066, signed by Roosevelt, in February 1942, authorized the internment of nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were American citizens. Families were given days or sometimes just hours to dispose of businesses and property before being relocated to hastily constructed camps in isolated areas. "We had done nothing wrong," remembered Masako Tanaka, who was 16 when her family was sent to Manzanar internment camp. "We were Americans. My brother was already in the army, but suddenly our loyalty was questioned because of our faces." Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, frantic recovery efforts began even as the smoke still rose from Battleship Row. Divers worked in nightmarish conditions to rescue trapped sailors. The USS Nevada, despite being badly damaged, had managed to get underway during the attack in an attempt to reach the open sea. Beached to prevent blocking the harbor entrance, she became a symbol of American resilience. The work to salvage the fleet began immediately, according to Naval Historical Center documents. What the Japanese had failed to destroy were the harbors, infrastructure, the submarine base, and the massive oil storage facilities. This oversight would prove strategically significant. Indeed, Admiral Nagumo's decision not to launch a third attack wave against these targets would later be considered a critical error. Had the oil reserves been destroyed, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would have been forced to retreat to the west coast, giving Japan a much freer hand in the Pacific for months. Across the Pacific, the Japanese offensive seemed unstoppable in these early months. The Philippines fell despite General Douglas MacArthur's defiant stance. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Hong Kong, Wake Island, Guam, and the Dutch East Indies all fell in rapid succession. Yet, even as Japanese forces advanced throughout the Pacific, the American response was gathering momentum. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor had eliminated any political obstacles to full mobilization. A nation of 130 million souls was now singularly focused on the objective that Roosevelt had articulated with stark clarity: complete and total victory. "No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion," Roosevelt had declared, "the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory." As winter turned to spring in 1942, those words would soon be tested in the crucible of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle squinted against the harsh wind on the deck of the USS Hornet as he conducted final checks on his B-25 bomber. The date was April 18, 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, and he was about to lead one of the most audacious raids in military history. 16 Army Air Forces bombers would launch from an aircraft carrier, something never before attempted with such large aircraft, to strike the Japanese homeland. The mission seemed nearly impossible. The bombers could not return to the carrier and would have to land in China after dropping their payloads on Tokyo. "We were detected by Japanese picket boats earlier than expected," Doolittle later wrote in his memoirs. "We were still 400 miles from Japan, too far for what we had planned, but Admiral Halsey gave the order to launch anyway. There was no turning back." The bombers thundered down the carrier deck, straining to become airborne before plunging into the ocean. Against all odds, all 16 aircraft successfully launched and reached Japan, bombing military and industrial targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya. Though the physical damage was minimal, the psychological impact was immense. Japan had believed its home islands invulnerable to air attack. According to the Tokyo Gazette, which reported on the raid in carefully censored terms, "Several enemy planes appeared over our capital city today, but were quickly dispersed by our air defenses." The reality, as later documented in The Doolittle Effect by historian Maria Chen, was far different. The Japanese high command was humiliated. Emperor Hirohito himself had to be rushed to a shelter. The myth of Japan's invincibility had been punctured. Most of Doolittle's raiders crashed in China after running out of fuel, with some captured by Japanese forces. Those who fell into Japanese hands faced torture, mock executions, and in some cases, execution. Yet the raid accomplished its primary objective, boosting American morale while forcing Japan to reconsider its defensive perimeter. Even as Doolittle's bombers struck Japan, Admiral Yamamoto was planning a decisive blow against the remaining American carrier force. His target, Midway Atoll, a tiny but strategic installation northwest of Hawaii. By seizing Midway, Japan could extend its defensive perimeter while potentially drawing out and destroying America's remaining aircraft carriers. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American cryptanalysts, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had partially broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25. Working around the clock in the basement of the Pearl Harbor submarine base, a stifling room they called the dungeon, Rochefort's team deciphered enough of the Japanese plan to give Admiral Chester Nimitz a priceless advantage. This decryption work represents one of the greatest intelligence triumphs in naval history, wrote former NSA analyst Derek Hoffman in Codebreakers, The Hidden Heroes of the Pacific War. Without Rochefort's insights, the Battle of Midway might have had a drastically different outcome. On June 4, 1942, Admiral Nagumo's first carrier striking force approached Midway with 4 fleet carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor. They launched their aircraft against the atoll early that morning, expecting to catch the Americans by surprise, just as they had at Pearl Harbor. Instead, they found the U.S. Pacific Fleet waiting. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet attacked the Japanese fleet but was decimated, with only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, surviving. However, these brave men had drawn down the Japanese combat air patrol, leaving the carriers vulnerable when American dive bombers arrived minutes later. Within 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed into floating infernos. The 4th Hiryu launched a counterattack that severely damaged the USS Yorktown before being sunk herself. By day's end, the battle that Admiral Yamamoto had hoped would finish the American Pacific Fleet had instead dealt a devastating blow to Japanese naval air power. At 10:22, we saw these dive bombers coming down, recalled Zero fighter pilot Masatake Okumiya, who survived the battle. They seemed to drop out of the sun. We couldn't reach them in time. Then Kaga was hit, and Akagi, and there was a fire everywhere. The strategic implications were enormous. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable experienced pilots. More significantly, they had lost the initiative in the Pacific War. Though many brutal battles lay ahead, the tide had turned just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. As the National Naval Archives later documented, the Battle of Midway stands as the turning point in the Pacific War. Japan, which had been on the offensive since December 7th, suddenly found itself forced into a defensive posture from which it would never fully recover. The tropical rain fell in sheets across Guadalcanal as Marine Sergeant John Basilone repositioned his machine gun crew. It was October 24, 1942, during what would later be called the Battle for Henderson Field. Throughout the night, waves of Japanese soldiers from the Sendai Division had hurled themselves against the American perimeter in desperate banzai charges. They just kept coming, Basilone later recounted to war correspondent Robert Sherrod. I was running between gun positions, carrying ammo, and clearing jams. The barrels were so hot, they seared my hands, but we couldn't stop firing, not for a second. By dawn, Basilone and his men had held their position against overwhelming odds. Nearly 100 Japanese dead lay in front of their gun emplacement alone. For his extraordinary bravery that night, Basilone would receive the Medal of Honor, though he would later give his life at Iwo Jima. Guadalcanal marked the beginning of America's island-hopping strategy in the Pacific, a brutal campaign that would unfold across scores of remote islands, many of which few Americans had ever heard of before the war. The strategy, conceived primarily by Admiral Ernest King and General Douglas MacArthur, avoided frontal assaults against heavily fortified Japanese positions when possible, instead seizing strategically important islands while bypassing others. The island-hopping campaign represents one of the most complex and successful joint Army-Navy-Marine Corps operations in American military history, notes Dr. Samuel Peterson in Pacific Strategy, The Road to Tokyo, published by the Naval War College. Review. It balanced strategic necessity against the reality of limited resources in a theater that spanned nearly one-third of the globe. After Guadalcanal came operations in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas. Each landing followed a similar pattern: naval bombardment, followed by Marine or Army assault forces securing beachheads, then pitched battles against Japanese defenders who typically fought to the last man rather than surrender. On Tarawa Atoll in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division suffered more than 3,000 casualties taking an island, barely 2 miles long. The operation exposed critical flaws in American amphibious doctrine, as landing craft ran aground on previously unknown reefs, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards under murderous fire. The water turned red with blood, remembered Corporal Edward Miller of the 2nd Marines. Men were falling everywhere. We just kept moving forward because there was nowhere else to go. These lessons came at a terrible cost, but led to improved tactics for future landings. Naval gunfire support was intensified, underwater obstacles were better charted, and new amphibious vehicles like the LVT, Landing Vehicle Tracked, or Amtrac, were deployed in greater numbers. By 1944, the tempo of American advances increased dramatically. Superior industrial capacity meant that the United States was now deploying new Essex-class aircraft carriers at the rate of almost one per month, while Japan struggled to replace its losses. American submarines were steadily strangling Japan's maritime supply lines, cutting off oil, rubber, and other vital resources from its conquered territories. In June 1944, the American offensive reached the Mariana Islands. After the capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, a new strategic reality emerged. The Japanese home islands were now within range of the revolutionary Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers. The massive 4-engine aircraft could carry larger bomb loads at higher altitudes than previous bombers, potentially beyond the reach of Japanese fighters. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command from bases in the Marianas, initially attempted precision bombing of Japanese military and industrial targets. When high-altitude accuracy proved disappointing, he made a controversial decision to switch to low-altitude night incendiary raids against Japanese cities, many of which were constructed primarily of wood and paper. According to declassified Strategic Bombing Survey documents, the firebombing campaign against Japanese cities was conceived as a means to destroy industrial capacity while simultaneously breaking civilian morale. The ethical considerations were largely subordinated to strategic necessity in the context of total war. The human cost was staggering. The March 9, 1945 firebombing of Tokyo killed an estimated 100,000 civilians in a single night, more than either atomic bombing would claim months later. Yet Japan's military leadership refused to consider surrender, instead preparing the home islands for a final, apocalyptic defense. As the noose tightened around Japan, American forces turned toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, stepping stones for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The ferocity of Japanese resistance at these locations suggested that Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan, would exact a terrible price in American lives. The largest naval battle in history began on October 23, 1944, as American forces under General Douglas MacArthur splashed ashore on Leyte Island in the Philippines. Standing in the surf, fulfilling the promise he had made 2 years earlier when forced to evacuate the islands, MacArthur declared, "Dramatically, people of the Philippines, I have returned." The Imperial Japanese Navy, executing its final major offensive operation of the war, launched a complex three-pronged attack to destroy the American invasion fleet. Admiral Takeo Kurida's powerful center force, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, approached through the San Bernardino Strait. A southern force under Admiral Shoji Nishimura would attack through Surigao Strait, while a northern force of carriers under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would serve as a decoy to draw away the American fast carrier task forces. The Battle of Leyte Gulf represents the death throes of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a cohesive fighting force, wrote naval historian Captain Jonathan Russell in Twilight of the Rising Sun, the Imperial Japanese Navy's final campaign. Despite brilliant tactical planning, their execution was hampered by poor communication, fuel shortages, and the overwhelming material superiority the Americans now possessed. The battle unfolded across more than 100,000 square miles of ocean in a series of related engagements. In the Sibuyan Sea, American aircraft sank the mighty Musashi after hitting her with at least 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes. At Surigao Strait, in the last battleship versus battleship action in naval history, American battleships, some of which had been damaged at Pearl Harbor and subsequently repaired, crossed the Japanese T and decimated Nishimura's force. The most dramatic action occurred off Samar Island, where a Japanese force including 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers surprised a small American escort carrier group designated Taffy 3. Against overwhelming odds, the American escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts fought back with incredible courage. The destroyer USS Johnston, under Commander Ernest Evans, charged the entire Japanese battle line alone, strafing the heavy cruiser Kumano with gunfire before launching torpedoes that blew off her bow. Though the Johnston was eventually sunk with the loss of most of her crew, including Evans, her sacrifice helped convince Admiral Kurita that he faced a much larger force than was actually present. According to Naval Institute archives, a Japanese lookout aboard the heavy cruiser Tone reportedly announced, "The whole United States Navy is coming," before Kurita ordered a retreat, one of the most fateful decisions of the Pacific War. Had he pressed forward, the largely defenseless American transports and supply ships off Leyte would have been devastated. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to function as an effective fighting force. However, a new and terrifying threat emerged in the form of kamikaze attacks, deliberately suicidal aircraft strikes against American ships. The word kamikaze referred to the divine wind that had twice saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century by destroying the enemy fleet in typhoons. The willingness to sacrifice oneself completely represents the final evolution of Japan's warrior ethos during the war, noted anthropologist Dr. Yuki Tanaka in Death Before Surrender, The Psychology of Kamikaze Operations. It reflects both the increasing desperation of Japan's strategic position and the cultural indoctrination that made such sacrifice appear noble rather than futile. The first organized kamikaze unit, the Shimpu Special Attack Corps, struck American ships off the Philippines in October 1944. By the Battle of Okinawa in April 1945, these attacks had reached their apex. Over a 3-month period, approximately 1,500 kamikaze aircraft attacked the American fleet, sinking 30 ships and damaging hundreds. War on the battle for Okinawa itself, codenamed Operation Iceberg, became the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. Just 350 miles from mainland Japan, Okinawa was defended by 110,000 Japanese troops under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, who had prepared an intricate network of fortifications, tunnels, and strongpoints. The 10th Army, consisting of 4 Army and 3 Marine divisions under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., landed on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday. Initially meeting little resistance, American forces quickly secured the northern part of the island. However, the Japanese had deliberately withdrawn to heavily fortified positions in the south, centered on the Shuri Line. What followed was a nightmare of mud, blood, and attrition, according to Marine Corps historical documents. Advances were measured in yards per day, with each ridge, cave, and ravine exacting a terrible price. Names like Sugarloaf Hill, Half Moon Hill, and Chocolate Drop became synonymous with some of the war's most intense combat. The Japanese defended each position with suicidal determination, often launching nighttime counterattacks with soldiers carrying satchel charges to destroy American tanks. By the time the island was declared secure on June 22nd, the human cost had been staggering. The Americans suffered approximately 50,000 casualties, including over 12,000 killed. Japanese military losses exceeded 100,000 dead. Most tragically, perhaps 1/3 of Okinawa's civilian population, between 40 and 150,000 people, perished in the crossfire. As American planners contemplated the upcoming invasion of Japan itself, the Okinawa experience suggested that casualties would be unprecedented. Staff estimates for Operation Downfall projected up to 1 million American casualties and potentially millions of Japanese deaths. As preparations continued, scientists raced to complete a secret weapon that might make such an invasion unnecessary. The mushroom cloud rose ominously over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, as the uranium bomb codenamed Little Boy detonated with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. Colonel Paul Tibbets, piloting the B-29 Superfortress Enola Gay, named after his mother, banked sharply after the blast to escape the shock wave. "My God, what have we done?" His co-pilot Robert Lewis scribbled in his logbook as they witnessed the devastation unfolding below. The atomic age had begun in fire and death. Nearly 80,000 people perished instantly in Hiroshima, with tens of thousands more succumbing to radiation sickness and injuries in the following weeks. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb, a plutonium implosion device nicknamed Fat Man, devastated the city of Nagasaki, killing an additional 40,000 people immediately. The development of the atomic bomb represented the most closely guarded secret of the war, wrote physicist Dr. Richard Feynman in his memoirs of working on the Manhattan Project. Most of us at Los Alamos understood the scientific implications, but the human consequences became apparent only after Hiroshima. The path to these cataclysmic events had begun years earlier, when Albert Einstein and other scientists warned President Roosevelt about Nazi Germany's potential to develop atomic weapons. This led to the Manhattan Project, a massive scientific and industrial undertaking that cost over $2 billion, equivalent to more than $30 billion in modern currency, and employed more than 130,000 people at its peak. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the first atomic bomb had not yet been tested. That would come on July 16th at the Trinity site in New Mexico, where project director J. Robert Oppenheimer famously recalled words from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The decision to use the atomic bombs against Japan remains one of history's most debated moral questions. President Harry Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death in April, justified it as a means to avoid the massive casualties expected in a conventional invasion. Others have argued that Japan was already effectively defeated, with its cities devastated by conventional bombing, its navy destroyed, and its people starving under blockade. The use of atomic weapons must be understood in the context of a war in which conventional morality had already been severely compromised, argued historian Martin Hamilton in Decisions at War's End, Truman and the Bomb, published by Oxford University Press. By 1945, the strategic bombing of civilian populations had been normalized by all major combatants. What is clear is that the Japanese government did not immediately surrender even after Hiroshima. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, known as the Big Six, remained deadlocked, with military hardliners arguing that they should fight to the bitter end, forcing better surrender terms through a costly defense of the home islands. Two additional factors finally broke the impasse. First, on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive against Japanese forces in Manchuria. Second, Emperor Hirohito himself intervened directly, an unprecedented step that broke centuries of imperial tradition. In a historic imperial conference held in an underground bunker as American B-29s roamed overhead, Hirohito stated, "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. Continuing the war can only result in the annihilation of our nation and the destruction of human civilization." Even then, military hardliners attempted a coup on the night of August 14th to prevent the surrender announcement from being broadcast. The Kyujo incident failed when the conspirators could not secure the support of the Imperial Guards Division, and several officers committed suicide rather than face the reality of defeat. At noon on August 15th, 1945, the unthinkable occurred. The Japanese people heard their emperor's voice for the first time in a radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender. Speaking in formal court Japanese that many citizens found difficult to understand, Hirohito never used the word surrender, instead stating that Japan would accept the provisions of the joint declaration of the Allied powers. The broadcast was met with stunned silence across Japan, according to testimony collected by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. Many wept openly. Some military officers committed ritual suicide, rather than endure the shame of defeat. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided as Supreme Commander of Allied powers, with representatives from all Allied nations in attendance. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz signed for the United States, while Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu signed for Japan. In his address, MacArthur expressed hope for a lasting peace. "It is my earnest hope, and indeed, the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice." The Pacific War had exacted an appalling human toll. More than 2,400,000 Japanese died, including nearly 1 million civilians. American military deaths exceeded 100,000, with many more wounded. China suffered. Between 15 and 20 million dead from Japanese occupation. The Philippines lost over 1 million civilians. Throughout occupied Asia, millions more perished from combat, starvation, disease, and atrocities. Yet from this devastation emerged a new world order. Japan, under American occupation led by MacArthur, underwent dramatic democratization and demilitarization. The emperor was retained as a symbolic figure, but stripped of divine status. A new constitution, largely drafted by American officials, renounced war and guaranteed civil liberties. The transformation of Japan from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy represents one of the most successful occupations in history, according to Dr. Eleanor Hammond's comprehensive study, Rising from Ashes, Post-War Japan and the American Occupation, published by Princeton University Press. Unlike the punitive conditions imposed on Germany after World War I, the American approach to Japan combined necessary justice for war crimes with practical efforts to rebuild Japanese society. The attack on Pearl Harbor had indeed awakened a sleeping giant, as Admiral Yamamoto had feared. From the shock and devastation of that Sunday morning in December 1941 to final victory less than 4 years later, America had mobilized its tremendous industrial, scientific, and human resources to defeat an enemy that had initially seemed invincible. President Truman, reflecting on the outcome in his memoirs, wrote, "The tragedy of Pearl Harbor was enormous, but in its aftermath, the American people demonstrated the resilience, determination, and moral courage that define our national character. From our darkest day emerged our finest hour." As the guns fell silent across the vast Pacific battlefield, the survivors began the long process of healing and rebuilding. For those who had witnessed the attack on Pearl Harbor, the circle had finally closed. The war that began with a surprise Attack had ended with an even more shocking demonstration of destructive power and the dawn of a new atomic age that would shape geopolitics for decades to come.